It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you here and now in the sacred ground of Glastonbury. Glastonbury is, and always will be, I think, inseparably linked with one of its strongest defending angels, that is the late John Michell, 1933 to 2009. His writings, his research, and his mystical conviction helped to revive the spirit of Avalon, especially in the 60s and 70s. He played a major role in inspiring the first of Glastonbury festivals and a generation of seekers to investigate the mysteries of ancient places and forgotten knowledge. It was John's work and personality that infused the first of the Megalithomania conferences, which was named after one of his books. The connection between John Michell and Michael Glickman goes back to at least 1990 and has to do with crop circles. Up until then, in the 1980s, crop circles were mostly just that, circles. Circles with rings, circles within circles, and circles with small outliers called grape shot. More and more crop circles began to appear every year, and then suddenly, bam, there were boxes. That is, the crop circles began to include rectangular features. This was a whole new level, and the new images were called pictographs. Enter Michael Glickman. Shazam. What happened was that the Center for Crop Circle Studies had been formed, and the Cereologist magazine had been founded with John Michell as its first editor. And John asked Michael to write a column for the magazine. This column was called The New Swirled Order, in which Michael entered into the wild fields of croppydom, much to the delight of the editor and the many readers who shared Michael's sense of beauty and humor combined. Michael went on to write several books, including Cornography, Dispatches from the Crop Circles. Anyway, today John Michell is on the other side, maybe sitting in a field of clouds, enjoying the weather in the shadows of heaven, and maybe a giant-sized smoke. But Michael Glickman is in this world here and now, and he's about to give us the third annual John Michell Memorial Talk at Megalithomania. Michelle and Michellettes.
Thank you. Of course, I'm delighted and indeed privileged to be given this amazing opportunity to talk. But I've been anxious about it for a year. John Wayne said, "Never apologize, never explain." And I won't apologize and I won't explain, but I have to tell you that I am very daunted by this task. It's as though somebody had asked me to do a talk on my weekends with Leonardo da Vinci. John was such a monumental figure in our lives, and years ago, when I was studying architecture, I realized that projects can be divided into two broad categories. They're either a postage stamp or a quilt. The postage stamp was a building, or indeed a film or a novel, which could have its essence sketched or described on a postage stamp. An idea of such power and clarity that on a postage stamp you could elucidate it. A quilt was something which was put together of many decorative, beautiful squares assembled together. Now, there are many films, novels and buildings which are postage stamps, which immediately kick you in the head with the clarity of their vision. This doesn't mean that quilts are bad. There are also many wonderful buildings which are quilt-like in their variety. There are many films which are episodic and have beautiful scenes. My talk is a quilt. It's an assembly of pictures of dear John, reminiscences, stories, perceptions, but I couldn't find a spine for it. One of the spines is the title, John and the Michellettes. Now, I mean this more in the spirit of Ray Charles and the Raylettes than cigar and cigarette. Cigar and cigarette is to do with the main element and miniature elements from it. Ray Charles and the Raylettes is to do with a central pivotal figure around whom revolve and are influenced by the master. And I think John was very much the hub on a bicycle wheel. And there are several spokes, and I think because I suppose I am one of those spokes, and if I'm a spoke at all, I'm a spoke on the wheel which was the geometry and number wheel of John Michell. He in fact was many bicycle wheels, and the Michellettes should be named, and they are, I think, as follows: Alan Brown, Michael Glickman, Robin Heath, John Martineau, and Malcolm Stewart. Now, those are kind of junior Michellettes. When we look a bit further, we find that there are master Michellettes who include Keith Richlow, Michael Schneider, and most notably John Neal, who was probably the only man who fully understood what John was talking about. Now, rather than trying to pull out how these people were directly influenced by John, I think we were all, in a very benign kind of way, given permission to push the boundaries. And while many of the examples which I'm going to show of the work which the Michellettes produced were not directly as a result of John's teaching or instruction or guidance, they were all somehow a result of the absorption of an atmosphere which could not exist without John Michell being there. And thinking about it very clearly, I realised that, and looking back over these last months when I've been thinking very deeply and widely about John, I realised that one of his major concerns was causality and acausality. That which can be explained and that which cannot be explained yet. And I think the work of all of us has continued to knock on this almost impenetrable wall of acausality, which is here and now in the 21st century a form of magic. Now, this talk is going to be littered with portraits of John, but this has been, I think, for all the Michellettes, and I've got to say that everybody in this room is a Michelette. We wouldn't be here unless we were Michellettes. But I have to say, for all of us who worked with his geometry and number, this diagram by John, which many people consider to be his major single achievement, is a very simple diagram. Essentially, the moon here is brought down to kiss the surface of the earth. If a square is put around the earth and a compass is placed at the center of the circle and the circle is drawn around through the center of the moon, what we find is happening, and we have to bear in mind here one of the most astonishing discoveries, and here we are truly knocking on the door of causality and acausality. If the size of the moon is 3 units, the size of the earth is 11 units, 3 to 11. And because of that, that is 3, so therefore that square is 3. That is 11, therefore that is 4, and that is 4. Therefore we have a 3, 4, 5 right angle triangle. And magically, that circle drawn through the center of the moon squares the circle, if that is the square drawn around the earth. Now, you look at that and you think, this demolishes the Newtonian scientific position. This batters at the doors of causality and acausality. Who could have imagined that such beauty could have occurred by coincidence? And we must bear in mind also that underneath all this is the ancient philosophical idea that the earth symbolically is square, while the circle symbolically represents God, heaven, the divine, all that is, and squaring of a circle, the simple geometric exercise of constructing a square which has a perimeter exactly the same as the circumference of a circle manifests symbolically a reconciliation between earth and heaven. This itself is an astonishing idea. But who would have thought that this idea was manifested so precisely and exactly within the heavens, within the material geometry of Earth and its satellites? This, for many people, among John's many gifts and discoveries, remains the most exciting one. This is a rationalization of the same drawing by Alan Brown, or by Michellettes, as Alan Brown, as they should call him. And this is a further rationalization of the same diagram by Michelette John Martineau, who discovered that phi, the golden section, was also embodied in the same diagram. There is John with John Martineau and Vivian, his oldest daughter, who I'm proud to say is my goddaughter. Now, let me go back and leave it on that and tell a story which is, I think, relevant to this central idea of causality and acausality. When I first became involved in the crop circle thing, I've never really been a full card-carrying UFO man, although I'm interested. And in the first year of my involvement with crop circles, somebody said, Jacques Vallée is talking in London. Now, Jacques Vallée is a UFO researcher, French UFO researcher, of a scientific background, with a scientific education. He was the French scientist portrayed by Truffaut in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It was in fact meant to be Jacques Vallée. But Jacques Vallée was talking at the Kensington Library, and he spoke about the Betty and Barney Miller abduction, a famous early abduction, where their car was stopped and there was a missing time experience. And afterwards, they were both hypnotically regressed, and they produced uncannily exactly the same stories under two different separate regressions. Talked about their being elevated to the famous belly of the mothership, where there were certain experimental procedures. Now, in his talk, Jacques Vallée recounted how he had spoken to the hypnotherapist and said to him, yes, okay, But if we had been there, would we have seen the same thing? Now, this sounds trivial, but it was almost a quarter of a century ago a revelation for me, because Jacques Vallée had a scientific education and he could not accept the mere testimony of ordinary human beings. He was worried about causality and acausality, and the fact that there was no way of incorporating these strange events into his scientific worldview. And let me put a hypothesis. Let me suggest that a lab technician in a white coat reported to his senior that he'd weighed something, and it weighed 8.5 grams. And Jacques Vallée later interviewed the senior scientist. Would he say to the senior scientist, if we had been there at the machine, would we have read 8.5 grams? Well, of course he wouldn't, because it was mediated by the intervention of measurement and a machine and human experience, which, of course, is the great bugbear of the scientific view, had intervened here to make the report absolutely solid. But the report of Betty and Barney Miller was mediated through human experience. The reading of the 8.5 weight on the scale was mediated by human experience. One was enormously doubtful because of the scientific worldview. The other was absolutely okay because a chrome machine with a dial had certified it. Perhaps I digress. This is, by coincidence, John Mack, a man of scientific education with John Michell, but John Mack uniquely was somebody who put at the center of his worldview human experience and the human spirit. It had not been amputated by a scientific education. And here's a quote from Candida Lycett Green at the beginning of a very nice little book called Michellettes, written shortly after John's death. And Candida says, above all, he made me realize that it was arrogant not to believe in almost everything. And this is a wonderful idea and a wonderful evocation of John's spirit. He made her understand that it was arrogant not to believe in almost everything. Now, some of the works of various Michellettes. This was a pendulum crop circle 91, and this is a diagram produced by John Martineau. And this was absolutely crucial because he put over it a pentagram or a series of pentagrams, if you draw a pentagram so that the arm crossing is on the perimeter of those circles, there and there, the points of the pentagram define another circle. That other circle precisely defines the location of the outrider and also defines the length of the spine by function of that geometry there. Now, this suddenly placed over the crop circles a level of will and wit which challenged the view that the crop circles were in some way random. Here was evidence that behind the crop circle phenomenon was a prodigious skill, a prodigious knowing. Where it's from, who it's from, what it's about, what it's trying to do, one cannot say. But you can't look at a diagram like that and say, this is accidental. A young John, obviously at Glastonbury. This is some work by me, a formation at Headbourne-Worthy, which was essentially a quintuplet, that is a 5-die spot. It had two unusual characteristics which screamed. Number one, the daughter circles, the 4 daughter circles, invaded the body of the mother. This had never happened before. They crashed into it and over it. And number two, to emphasize their position, they were individually framed. This intrigued me for months. And I then realized that if one drew a line through the center of every one of those satellite circles, it squared the circle. It squared the big circle. So once again, one was faced with the conundrum of a knowing precision defying the idea of acausality. There is a causality here. There is an intent to communicate something with us. Now, I'm going slightly ahead. When I moved into the crop circles, I was very intrigued. I did not know in 1990 that they would become so central to my life. But I was an architect, and I was very interested in geometry. I was interested in number. I was also very interested in the currently inexplicable. It was fascinating. I loved frogs in rocks, spontaneous human combustion, rains of fishes. That whole area of stuff intrigued me. I thought, the crop circles, that's an interesting little dilemma. We'll sort this out. And I started to get involved with what was then a quorum of senior people who were keeping a very firm grip on the crop circle phenomenon. They believed they owned it. And the only person I had ever heard of was John Michell, who was one of my heroes. And when I started to meet these people, I had an absolutely snotty reception from everybody but the one who I thought was a demigod. John was delightfully friendly, welcoming, sharing. He became an immediate pal. And the others, who were fundamentally largely non-entities, wouldn't speak to me. I found this to be very strange. And at this stage, I was the best man at the literary editor's wedding, the literary editor of The Guardian. And he called me up one day, and there was a book published called Round in Circles by an American guy. And it was a truly nasty, gossipy book. And he asked me to write a review of the book for The Guardian, which of course I did. And I wrote a particularly vicious review of this very bad book, which I'm delighted to say produced letters from New York threatening litigation. The mafia is a body from which one can learn a great deal, and they always teach that if you have a gun in your pocket, you do not say, "I've got a gun in my pocket," much less do you say, "Here's a gun, I'm going to shoot you." You either whack them or you keep it there. And I was very nervous to receive this threatening letter from a firm of lawyers in Manhattan with 58 partners. And the legal man at The Guardian, who was clearly very experienced, took very much to mafia line, and he said, when the writ arrives, we might start to take it seriously. So that never happened. But John read this review, and I think he liked it, and some weeks later, the seriologist was rolling, and he said, "Michael, I'd like you to do a review." And he asked me to write a review of a book called Crop Circles, a mystery solved, ? I think I can comfortably say this is the worst crop circle book ever written. And I wrote another appropriately vicious review, which I think John liked. And then, some time later, we were at a meeting in Saffron Walden, a meeting about labyrinths. And John took me aside and said, "Michael, would you like to write a column for the seriologist?" And I said, "Oh, that's very nice, I'll do a column, a single column, very nice." He said, "No, I'd like you to be the regular columnist." And I said, "But John, I know absolutely nothing about crop circles." And he replied, Exactly, my dear. And this brief exchange set me on my questionable career. So I have John to thank, really. And New World Order started there. I became closer involved with the Syriologist and his wonderful 3 monthly launch parties in his eyrie at the top of number 11, whatever it was, in Notting Gate, which were wonderful events where we launched a new volume of the Syriologist, which is still, I go back to read it every year, and it's still a great, open-minded, open-ended publication. He was not driving, and I was living in London at that time, and we would arrange to go down to Wiltshire, and I'd drive down to Notting Hill Gate and scoop him, and we'd come and see some circles and chat. And I suppose I became close to him. He was a wonderful man. And he told me at this stage 2 things. This was the early 90s. He said, to understand a phenomenon, you must first look at what it does to people. And I remembered it. I didn't fully understand it. But I realized the wisdom of that. We cannot start to look at crop circles without first looking at what they do to people. And the other thing he said was, you will always find what you start out looking for, which is another interesting thing. You will find what you look for, both of which are injunctions which seem to be constantly valuable, constantly useful. I went to live in California, and I used to get postcards from him very often. I used to call him from California. This is one of the postcards of a formation, but what is amazing, and this says something about his beautiful watercolors. If I close in for a moment, just on that bit, look at that. This man, this genius, this avatar, this guru, this teacher, this master, spent hours creating that dotted, multicolored background by hand in the early hours of the morning. I mean, it takes my breath away. I've owned this little piece for several years, and only in the run-up to this lecture did I stare at it closely to reveal the level of work that has gone into that. Now here is another thing. This is a formation in '96. This was the famous Oliver's Castle formation, which produced a video. We showed two pairs of two bolts of light going over it as the formation goes down. It produced a great rift in the community. I, being a New Age crystal fairy and bliss bunny and woo-woo believer, knew it was real. I had no doubt about that. And I spent several months, I actually surveyed it. And this is an accurate measured survey of the formation. And I spent several months, I was living in California at the time, and I thought, this is obviously a six-fold formation, but there must be something else in it. There must be something at the level of the Martineau analytical geometry overlaying it and constraining it, because it seemed to me that this was the formation that the crop circle authorities had selected for this amazing vision of the luminosities cycling over it, laying the formation down. And I assumed naively that if I laid a 5-pointed pentagram over it, this would work. And it didn't work at all. Now, what was unusual about this formation, among many things, was that the avenues between A and B were 4 feet wide. And when I say 4 feet, I mean to a fraction. I have never measured a crop circle before or since which was so exactly dimensioned. But the avenues from B to C were exactly 3 feet wide. And again, it was of a precision that I'd never met before or since. 4 feet and 3 feet. I couldn't work it out at all. And then I tormented myself staring at this and doing sketches. And I suddenly thought, maybe 4 and 3 is being telegraphed to me for a reason. Maybe it's 7. Now, 7-fold geometry had never existed in or around the crop circles. But I thought, I'll put a 7-fold geometry on it. And if we set up a 7-fold star on the mother circle with the arm crossing there, the outer points precisely encompass the B circle. It was a 7-fold geometry. So I phoned John from California, excitedly, and I said, John, I've discovered that, he was also blown away by the video. And months later, it took me months to work out. I said, I found a 7-fold star is the constraint, the controlling geometry of Oliver's Castle. What does 7 mean? And he said, 7 is the number of spirit revelation, the the eternal feminine, and what lies behind the veil. I mean, he was wonderful. Who would know that? Who would be able to say 7 is the number of spirit, revelation, the eternal feminine, and what lies behind the veil? And how appropriate that this is a formation which illuminated for us a tiny glimpse of how the crop circles might be made. Spirit and revelation. John with megalith. This is the Earl of Haddington, John Haddington, who was an early crop circle enthusiast, and I used to go up there a lot. On one occasion, I went up there with John, and we stayed at this kind of brideshead revisited aristocratic pile, and inevitably the quarters where you stayed were over here, and this fundamentally was a gigantic tourist trap. But I went there with, I think, John and Patrick Harper, who was the literary editor of the Seriologist, and it was the winter, and it was so cold. I mean, it was viciously cold. I mean, can you imagine what it costs to heat a place like that? And we were sent up to the guest rooms, which were at this level. And I remember at dinner, John said to his wife, "Jane, where have you put Michael tonight?" And she said, "Oh, I put him in the teeth." And I said, "What's the teeth? What's the teeth?" He said, "Oh, doesn't matter. I said, "What is this?" And I was very scared to be sleeping in an icy room called the teeth. So the three of us, myself, Patrick and John Michell, set up to go to bed, and we had to wind our way up a stone servant circulus there. And John, having heard this reference to teeth, told us a ghost story on the way up in this chilly house about a man who goes to an inn on a winter's night and said, "Well, I must have a room." And they say, sorry, we're full. And he says, "Look, I'll sleep anywhere, but I've got to get out." And they said, "Okay, there's one room you can have, but we don't really want to let you sleep there." He said, "No, I must have it, I don't care what. And he went up, sleep in the room, and he was woken in the middle of the night, according to John's ghost story, by a terrible feeling of coldness by his side. And he turned over, and there was a boy lying in his bed. And he turned, and the boy said to him, "I'm only a cold lad." And Patrick Harper said, "Or at least that's what he told the magistrate." But, I mean, the beauty of John was his ability to pull out an appropriate tale for these circumstances. I discovered over breakfast that what happened in the teeth was they had a friend staying who had false teeth, and took them out at night and put them in the usual antiseptic cup of water. and they were gone in the morning and never discovered. I am not myself a false teeth waiter, so I John on a megalith, John at home, and as well as these watercolours, I used to get these notes, and I used to get an envelope with my address on it. There was this wonderful italic hand, you know. Another thing about him that I miss enormously is not only his watercolours, but his tiny, beautifully crafted little notes. Now, we dealt briefly with squaring the circle and also with the Pythagorean triangle, the 3, 4, 5 triangle. This is a work by Michellettes Robin Heath, an astonishing discovery that if we take London, the capital of England, Cardiff, the capital of Wales, and Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, and we draw a triangle between them, it is a right-angled Pythagorean triangle. Now, causality and acausality. This is accurate to literally yards. Those numbers there, if you multiply those numbers by, I think, 25, you then get the number of royal miles, which defines the length of each of the sides. Royal mile is 8/7 of a mile. But these things, this triangle is accurate within yards. And once again, we come back to causality and acausality. How could this be? It turns the mind to scrambled egg. That is an illustration from Robin's book, which is a very provocative book. I mean, it has many of that kind of example in it, which is beyond our current understanding. I mean, it really bangs our head against the door of acausality, something without a definable cause yet. Famous picture of John by David Bailey. This is a cover of a book that John wrote with Alan Brown, which is, and I refer back to Crop Circles, A Mystery Solved, ? The worst book on the subject ever written, and I think Crooked Solely by John Michell and Alan Brown is arguably the best book on the crop circles ever written. Alan Brown went on to show that a very large percentage, something well over 95% of all crop circles in the quintuplet configuration, which is the dice 5 spot, they all, in one way or another, squared the circle. So that there was a level within each of these laid patterns. There was a level of invisible, constraining wisdom and order and intent, which is not available to us unless, like Alan Brown, you spend a year or so researching it. This, I think, is the last photograph taken of John at Dorset, at his son's house. John Martineau and I were lucky enough to visit him there while, I suppose, 2 or 3 weeks before his death, while he was still on his feet. Here is John now, caressing Plato. And I put this up because this is so much of his spirit. You need not be a scientist or study at the Slade to see that there is geometry in everything God made. Go into any tea shop and you won't have long to wait for one poached egg on toast, and there's the proof upon your plate. And I think he has left a John Michell-shaped void in our universe. And I asked Alan for some thoughts, and he wrote, John was a pal, and I suppose that's the main thing, that someone as learned and inspirational as John would have even considered being pals with the likes of me. It was as though he recognized something in me that I missed. I'd been a fan of John's work long before I ever met him. To end up working so closely with him for the last few years of a life was both a joy and a privilege. John's view of the world was so at odds with modern day rational materialism. To hang out with someone who was so robust in his defense of a more spiritual vision of the nature of reality was very empowering. That stayed with me, even though John is no longer here. And I end there. Thank you very much.